August 2026. Deep Everglades sawgrass marsh, 2 in the morning. An infrared camera trap catches a small mechanical form twitching in the darkness, warm to the sensor, moving just enough. Then something 14 feet long slides into frame. The robot rabbit program is working. So how did an untested decoy concept end up becoming documented evidence that could change how we fight one of America's worst invasive species? 1 year ago, nobody knew if a Burmese python would care. That was the real question. Not whether engineers could build a convincing fake rabbit. They could. The question was whether a predator that hunts by heat signature and motion, a predator that has quietly dismantled native prey populations across South Florida for decades, would be fooled by a solar-powered machine sitting in a marsh at midnight. Tonight, the camera trap answered that. I'm your host, and what you're watching unfold is one of the most improbable wildlife intervention stories in recent American conservation history. A story about losing an ecosystem one silent kill at a time, and then fighting back with 40 small robots and a lot of data. Here's what you need to understand going in. Burmese pythons have been spreading through South Florida since the 1980s. Estimates put their population in the tens of thousands. They don't announce themselves. They compress, they wait, and they eat. Marsh rabbits, native, essential, woven into the food web, have been nearly eliminated in python-dense zones. Not reduced, nearly eliminated. Dr. Robert McCleary at the University of Florida identified the core bottleneck years ago, and it wasn't what most people assumed. The problem isn't removal. Once you find a python, you can remove it. The problem is detection. These animals are almost impossible to locate in dense sawgrass. You can walk within 3 feet of a 14-foot python and never know it's there. That insight is what drove the decoy program. Roughly 40 solar-powered, heated, motorized rabbit decoys were deployed across the marsh in summer 2025. Each one mimics the thermal signature and movement pattern that a python's heat-sensing pits are tuned to detect. The python finds the decoy finds the python, and a camera trap records everything. However, deploying the system was only the beginning. The data from that first full year, one complete breeding season, is what nobody could predict. And what it shows is stranger and more promising than the researchers publicly expected. How does someone go from a promising laboratory concept to a field-hardened detection system running continuously through one of the most punishing ecosystems on the planet? Drag 40 robotic decoys into the Everglades in the weeks before breeding season begins. Bolt them down in the sawgrass and the cypress sloughs, wire them to solar panels, and then wait. Wait through the heat. Wait through the rain. Wait through whatever a South Florida winter decides to throw at you, which can range from a clear 70-degree morning to a tropical downpour that turns the marsh into something closer to a shallow lake. That is exactly what Dr. Robert McCleary's team did. And the window they chose to do it in was not arbitrary. It was chosen because Burmese pythons, for all their alien strangeness, follow a calendar. Roughly November through April, the snakes shift their behavior in a way that makes them, for the first time all year, genuinely findable. Breeding aggregations pull males toward females across distances that would seem impossible for an animal that spends most of its life invisible. A receptive female releases chemical signals, pheromones carried through the air and across the ground, and males follow, sometimes several males at once, coiling together in slow, patient competition. The marsh, which is normally a place where pythons simply disappear, becomes for a few months a place where they move. That movement is the detection window. It is the one period when the snakes are not just surviving, but actively searching. And if you want to intercept an animal that is already searching, you need something worth finding. The 40 robotic decoys were designed to be exactly that. Each unit combines 2 signals that a python uses to locate warm-blooded prey: heat and motion. A small heating element raises the surface temperature of the decoy into the range a python's pit organs would associate with a living animal. Slow, irregular movement, the kind that mimics a rabbit or a small mammal going about its business, completes the picture. The combination is not a perfect replica of a live rabbit. It does not need to be. It only needs to be convincing enough to trigger what researchers call investigative behaviour. Curiosity, the slow, deliberate approach of a predator that has not yet committed but has decided to get closer. 40 of these units running simultaneously across the landscape. That is not a trivial number. Each one represents a data point, a potential interaction, a camera trap waiting to record whatever comes to investigate. And each one had to survive conditions that would test electronics designed for far gentler environments. South Florida in winter is not the postcard version of Florida. The humidity never really leaves. Storms roll in off the Gulf with almost no warning. The solar panels powering each decoy had to generate enough energy on overcast days to keep the heating elements and motion systems running through the night, because pythons are not strictly diurnal. They move when conditions suit them, and conditions in the Everglades can shift between a cloudless afternoon and a 3-day overcast stretch with the kind of casual indifference that makes field research genuinely difficult. The engineering team had stress-tested the solar design, but stress tests happen in controlled environments. The Everglades is not a controlled environment. The decoys also had to survive what the marsh does to everything: the slow, patient work of water and heat and organic decay. Cables corrode, joints seize, panels fog, every piece of equipment that goes into that ecosystem comes out changed, usually in ways you did not anticipate. The team had built redundancy into the system, but redundancy only helps if you catch the failure before the data is lost. That was only round one. Getting the hardware into the field and keeping it running was the baseline challenge. The deeper question, the one that the entire experiment was built to answer, was whether any of it would actually matter. Whether a Burmese python, one of the most successful invasive predators in North American history, an animal that has systematically removed somewhere between 80 and 97% of certain small mammal populations from the Everglades over the past 3 decades, would pay any attention at all to a robot. Think about what that statistic actually means for a moment: 80 to 97%. In areas where marsh rabbits, raccoons, opossums, and white-tailed deer were once common, surveys conducted after the python population established itself found near-total collapse. Not decline. Collapse. The kind of numbers that ecologists describe in the careful, measured language of peer review, but that land, when you actually sit with them, like something out of a different kind of story entirely. A landscape that looks unchanged from the air, the same sawgrass, the same water, the same sky, but that is functionally emptied of the animals that used to fill it. The decoys were built to exploit the sensory system that made pythons such effective hunters in the first place. But there was a real and legitimate scientific concern that an animal hunting in a landscape stripped of prey might have recalibrated in some way, that the absence of small mammals might have changed the snake's behaviour at a level that a robotic lure could not reach. The solar power design was a warning sign. The team had flagged early in the planning process that extended cloud cover during the November to April window could create gaps in the decoy's operational cycles, periods when the heating elements would drop below the thermal threshold that makes them detectable to a python's pit organs. The engineers had built buffer capacity into the battery systems, but the buffer had limits. McCleary's team ignored it in the sense that they pressed forward, accepting that some percentage of operational time would be compromised by weather. They had to. A perfect system that never leaves the laboratory proves nothing. One full breeding season, that was the threshold. One complete cycle of python movement and aggregation, with 40 decoys running across multiple sites, with camera traps recording every interaction, with researchers logging every verified approach. That was what McCleary's team had defined as proof of concept. Not removal numbers, not body counts, verified interactions, evidence that the system could do the one thing it was designed to do before anyone started talking about scaling it up or deploying it operationally across the 2 million acres of the Everglades ecosystem. 6D, the bar for success was deliberately modest, which is either a sign of rigorous scientific caution or a sign that nobody was entirely sure the thing would work at all. The season ran. The cameras recorded. The data came in from 40 sites across the marsh, through the rain and the overcast days, and the nights when the temperature dropped just enough to make the heating elements work harder than the solar panels could comfortably sustain. And when the team finally pulled the footage and began the long, careful work of reviewing what the camera traps had captured, the picture that emerged was not what anyone had publicly predicted. The same technology that built the team's confidence in the laboratory was about to destroy it, or confirm it, in the field. And the answer was already sitting in the footage, waiting to be seen. Picture a single camera trap, mounted low on a cypress knee at the edge of a shallow slope somewhere in the interior of the Everglades. The frame is mostly darkness. The timestamp in the corner reads somewhere well past midnight. The decoy is visible in the center of the shot, its heating element running, its motion system cycling through the slow, irregular movement pattern the engineers programmed to mimic a small mammal at rest. The sawgrass around it is perfectly still, and then something moves at the edge of the frame. It does not lunge, it does not strike. It moves the way Burmese pythons always move when they are not in a hurry, which is with a kind of liquid patience that is genuinely difficult to describe if you have never seen it. The head lifts slightly. The tongue flickers, sampling the air, reading the chemical information that a python's Jacobson's organ translates into something like a map of what is nearby and how warm it is, and whether it is worth investigating further. The body follows in a long, slow arc, and the snake moves toward the decoy. That footage, and footage like it recorded at multiple sites across different nights and different weeks of the breeding season, is what Dr. McCleary's team spent months carefully reviewing and cataloguing. And the word they kept returning to in their reporting was specific: documented approaches, not captures, not confirmed kills or removal events. Approaches. Verified camera-recorded instances of a wild Burmese python moving toward an artificial thermal motion lure in a field setting. The distinction matters enormously, and the team was deliberate about maintaining it. There is a long history in invasive species management of promising early results being reported in ways that outrun the actual evidence, and McCleary's group was clearly aware of that history. What they had was not a removal tool, not yet. What they had was something more foundational, and in its own way more significant. The first field evidence that artificial thermal motion lures can attract wild Burmese pythons. That had never been demonstrated before, not in the Everglades, not anywhere. The laboratory work had suggested it was plausible. The thermal imaging studies had confirmed that pythons respond to heat signatures in controlled settings. But a controlled setting is not a cypress slough at 2 a.m. with 40 competing sensory inputs and no walls to funnel the animal toward the stimulus. The field is where theories go to be tested, and plenty of theories that survived the laboratory did not survive the field. This one did. Multiple separate events, multiple decoy sites, multiple time periods spread across the November to April breeding window. The pattern held, and that wasn't even the part that got people angry. What the footage also showed, and what the researchers were careful to document alongside the approach events, was the mechanism. The combination of heat and motion was not incidental. It appeared to be load-bearing. Pythons that passed near decoys running only the heating element without the motion component showed less consistent investigative behaviour. Pythons that encountered the full combination, warmth plus irregular movement, were the ones whose body language shifted in that characteristic way. Head up, tongue active, trajectory bending toward the source. This is actually consistent with what we know about how Burmese pythons hunt in the wild. The pit organs, those small, heat-sensitive pits along the upper and lower jaw, are extraordinarily precise instruments. They can detect temperature differences as small as 0.003 degrees Celsius. They can resolve the shape of a warm object well enough to allow a strike in complete darkness. But the pit organs work best in combination with olfactory information. A warm object that also smells like prey and moves like prey creates a convergent signal that is very difficult for the snake's nervous system to dismiss. The decoys were not producing olfactory signals. They were not releasing rabbit pheromones or mammal scent. And yet the approach behaviour appeared consistently enough across sites and events to suggest that heat plus motion alone was crossing some threshold of plausibility in the snake's sensory processing. If the team had stopped here, this would be a very different story. A proof of concept, a published paper, a modest claim that the system worked well enough to justify further study. That would have been a legitimate and valuable scientific contribution, and it might have ended there, another promising idea in the long and complicated history of Everglades python management that never quite scaled into something operational. But the breeding season data raised a question that the approach numbers alone could not answer. The decoys were attracting pythons. That was established. The next question was whether attraction translated into anything that could actually reduce the population. And that question pointed not toward the laboratory or the camera traps, but toward the human hunters who had been working the Everglades with nothing but their own instincts and decades of hard-won knowledge. And somehow it gets worse before it gets better. Because the scale of what those hunters were dealing with, the sheer, staggering biomass of pythons already established in the system, was about to be made very clear by a competition that put the best python hunters in Florida on a clock and watched what happened. Someone specific saw it coming. Dr. McCleary's team had noted in their internal documentation that the approach data, while promising, represented a vanishingly small fraction of the estimated python population in the study area. They said it plainly in their notes. Nobody outside the research community was listening yet. The Everglades in late July sits under a sky that feels almost solid. The heat is not a temperature so much as a presence, a wet, pressing weight that turns the sawgrass into a shimmering blur at the horizon. The water beneath your boots is warm. The air above it is warmer. And somewhere out in that maze of slough and hammock and mangrove shadow, Burmese pythons are doing exactly what they have been doing for 40 years. Moving, feeding, reproducing, and disappearing back into a landscape that was never designed to give them up easily. That is the world the 2026 Florida Python Challenge walked into. Late July through early August, 10 days, 907 registered participants drawn from 30 US states, Canada and Vietnam. And no, I'm not making that up. Nearly 1,000 people, some of them seasoned wildlife handlers, some of them first-time volunteers who had watched a documentary and decided they needed to do something, all of them descending on South Florida with one shared objective: find the snakes and pull them out. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The 2026 event was the largest single organised human removal effort in Everglades history by participant count. Not the most pythons ever removed in a single year by professional programs. Those numbers are different and we will get to them. But by the sheer volume of registered human participants converging on a defined geographic area over a defined window of time. Nothing had ever looked like this before. PBS NewsHour covered it. CBS Evening News ran segments. The Associated Press filed dispatches that moved across international wire services. For a brief, bright stretch of summer, the Burmese python was front-page news in a way it had not been since the early awareness campaigns of the 2000s, when the scale of the invasion was first becoming legible to the public. And the result: 280 invasive Burmese pythons removed across 10 days. 280. Hold that number for a moment. 907 people, 10 days in the field. The full weight of public attention, media infrastructure, sponsor support, and genuine human determination. And the Everglades gave up 280 snakes. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. Because that headline number, 280, lands differently depending on what you already know about the ecosystem those snakes came from. Researchers working in the Greater Everglades have produced population estimates that range, conservatively, into the tens of thousands of animals. Some models push higher. The pythons have colonized an area exceeding 2,000 square miles of habitat. Much of it roadless, much of it inaccessible to human searchers on foot, and essentially all of it structured in a way that rewards concealment. A python in the Everglades is not hiding because it is afraid. It is hiding because that is simply what pythons do. They are ambush predators shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into near-perfect stillness. Finding them requires either extraordinary skill, extraordinary luck, or a method that removes the concealment advantage entirely. The challenge participants, to their enormous credit, understood this going in. The event is not structured around the fantasy that human searchers can solve the python problem by walking transects and checking likely spots. It is structured around public engagement, around building a constituency of people who understand the stakes, around generating the kind of media attention that keeps research funding politically viable. On those terms, the 2026 event was a genuine success. The coverage was real. The attention was real. The 280 snakes removed were real animals that would not reproduce, would not consume another limpkin or woodstalk or white-tailed deer fawn. But 280, against a population that almost certainly numbers in the tens of thousands, is a fraction so small it resists easy metaphor. You could remove 280 pythons every single month for a decade, and the population models suggest you would not achieve meaningful suppression. The math is unforgiving. Pythons reach reproductive maturity in 3 to 5 years. A single female can produce clutches of 50 to 100 eggs. The habitat is effectively infinite from the perspective of a cold-blooded ambush predator that requires almost no active territory. The Everglades does not run out of places to hide a python. It never has. By the closing weekend of the 2026 challenge, the numbers were already being passed by the research community in ways that the press coverage did not quite capture. The aggregate catch was celebrated, and rightly so, as a record for organised public events. The volunteer energy was genuine and moving. People who had driven from Ohio, flown from Canada, taken unpaid leave from jobs they needed because they wanted to put their hands on the problem directly. That impulse is not nothing. In conservation, sustained public will is often the difference between a program that survives its first budget cycle and one that doesn't. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The cameras were rolling, the numbers were climbing, and the atmosphere in the base camps had the charged, purposeful feeling of people who believe they are making a difference. That didn't last, because when the final tallies came in and the researchers began breaking down the catch data by participant, a single number emerged from the data set that reframed everything. One participant, one name, and a catch total that accounted for more than a third of the entire event's removal. Tom Rahill removed 96 Burmese pythons from within Everglades National Park boundaries over the 10 days of the 2026 challenge. 96. He won the ultimate grand prize. And the number, when you sit with it, stops being a celebration and starts being a question. 907 participants. 184 pythons spread across the remaining 906 of them. That is an average of roughly 1 python per 5 people over 10 full days in the field. Rahill alone accounted for more than 1 in every 3 snakes removed from the entire event. He is an experienced handler. His methods are not transferable to a general volunteer pool, The skill required to find and safely extract a Burmese python at the rate Rahil operates is not something you develop in a weekend orientation. It accumulates over years of fieldwork, of learning how the light moves through the slough at different hours, of understanding which hammock edges hold warmth after a cold front, of developing the kind of pattern recognition that does not come from a training manual. Rahil's 96 pythons are a testament to what deep expertise looks like when it operates at full capacity inside the right landscape. They are also a quiet indictment of the structural limits of human-led removal as a population management strategy. This is the open loop that Dr. McCleary's team was already sitting with when the challenge concluded. The robot rabbit data, promising as it was, represented a fraction of the estimated population. The challenge data, impressive as it was, illustrated something the researchers had been saying in careful, measured language for years. The skill required to find pythons at meaningful scale is so concentrated in so few individuals that no volunteer program, however large, can distribute it widely enough to shift the population curve. Think back to that camera trap image from the dark edge of the sawgrass, the decoy rabbit motionless in the frame, the python moving toward it with a patience that looks almost deliberate. That image was never really about the rabbit. It was about the gap between what the snake knows about that landscape and what we know. Rahil has spent years narrowing that gap. The rest of us are still standing at its edge, looking in. The Everglades does not yield its secrets to effort alone. It yields them, slowly and partially, to understanding. And understanding, it turns out, is the one thing that does not scale easily. Ram Levinson's 16'5" python, caught inside Everglades National Park, could have produced 100 eggs this season alone. One animal, one clutch, years of damage, walking on 400 scales. The robot rabbits are still out there.